The 4th of June 1942 began as Japan expected it to. Dawn spread slowly across the Pacific, pale light revealing the orderly decks of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers as they turned into the wind. Engines warmed. Crews moved with rehearsed precision. This was the moment Japan's navy had been built for a decisive strike against an enemy already wounded. At Pearl Harbor, the Americans had bled. Now, at Midway, they would be finished. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo watched the launch with confidence, shaped by months of success. His carriers represented the finest naval air arm in the world, crewed by pilots trained through years of relentless discipline. American morale, Japanese intelligence insisted, was brittle. Their fleet was damaged, their sailors inexperienced, their commanders cautious. The battle ahead was expected to be methodical, almost instructional. Japan would dictate the tempo. America would react. Then the reports began to arrive, hesitant at first, then unmistakable. Enemy aircraft. Then something far worse. American carriers sighted. The words carried disbelief with them. According to every plan, every estimate, the U.S. fleet should not be here. Not yet. Not this far west. Not this soon. The timing alone suggested something deeply wrong. Moments later, the sky delivered the answer. American dive bombers appeared suddenly out of clear blue air, descending with purpose rather than desperation. Their arrival was not chaotic, it was synchronized. Deck crews on Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu looked up as bombs fell into aircraft crowded with fuel and ordnance. In minutes, 3 carriers, symbols of Japanese naval supremacy, were transformed into burning wrecks. For the sailors watching from the decks and the sea, the shock was total. This was not the enemy they had been taught to expect. These Americans had not stumbled blindly into battle. They had arrived at precisely the right moment, exploiting vulnerability with speed and nerve. This was not panic, it was calculation under pressure. In those burning minutes, something fundamental shifted. The battle was not yet over, but certainty was. Japan had entered the morning believing it understood its enemy. By mid-morning, that belief lay in flames alongside its carriers. To understand how this misjudgment took root, and why its consequences were so devastating, the story must move backward to the assumptions Japan carried into the war and the enemy it never truly saw coming. Long before the first bombs fell at Midway, Japan had already decided who the Americans were. In pre-war naval doctrine, the United States was not viewed as an equal in spirit, only in material. Japanese planners believed American sailors would falter in close combat, lacking the resolve required for decisive battle. Victory, in their view, belonged to those who embraced sacrifice and discipline over comfort and numbers. Cultural narratives reinforced this conviction. The United States was portrayed as wealthy, mechanized, and soft, powerful in industry, but fragile in will. American sailors were imagined as technicians rather than warriors, dependent on machines to compensate for an absence of fighting spirit. In Japanese war colleges, this belief hardened into assumption. Faced with sustained pressure, Americans would retreat rather than endure. Pearl Harbor seemed to confirm everything. The attack crippled battleships, stunned the Pacific Fleet, and delivered psychological shock alongside physical damage. Japanese officers interpreted the American response confusion, loss, withdrawal, not as resilience under surprise, but as proof of weakness exposed. The U.S. Navy, they concluded, had been broken early and would take years to recover its confidence. Within the Imperial Japanese Navy, pride in training deepened the divide. Carrier pilots had been shaped by brutal selection processes that eliminated the average and preserved only the exceptional. Long hours, relentless drills, and unforgiving standards created an elite few who believed themselves unmatched. American carrier crews, by contrast, were seen as inexperienced and untested, numerous perhaps, but shallow in skill. Propaganda amplified these ideas into certainty. Newspapers and broadcasts depicted Americans as prone to panic, dependent on overwhelming force to compensate for individual inadequacy. Defeat, when it came to the United States, would be sudden and decisive. The enemy would collapse not because it was destroyed, but because it lacked the endurance to continue. These assumptions did more than shape opinion. They shaped decisions. They informed risk, timing, and expectation. Japan entered the Pacific War believing it understood the character of its opponent, convinced that courage and initiative rested on one side alone. What remained unexamined was why those beliefs felt so unshakable, and how history, tradition, and early success combined to blind Japan to a reality it had never tested. Japan's confidence at Midway was not improvised. It had been forged deliberately over decades of naval tradition that prized initiative, discipline, and decisive battle above all else. From the aftermath of the Russo-Japanese battle onward, the Imperial Japanese Navy cultivated an identity built on elite professionalism. Officers were educated to believe that victory belonged to those who struck first, struck hardest, and possessed the moral clarity to accept sacrifice without hesitation. By the late 1932, this belief was no longer questioned. It was institutional truth. That confidence found its most refined expression in carrier aviation. Japan did not merely adopt aircraft carriers, it mastered them early. Through relentless training, it perfected coordinated aerial attack, integrating fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes into a single, devastating system. The strike on Pearl Harbor was not an anomaly. It was proof of concept. No navy in the world had executed such a complex carrier operation so precisely. To Japanese planners, this confirmed that they were operating on a level others had not yet reached. From that success flowed a dangerous assumption. If Japan possessed the world's most disciplined pilots and the most sophisticated carrier doctrine, then no Western navy burdened by bureaucracy and diluted by scale could match it. Initiative, they believed, would always favor the side willing to act decisively. Adaptation, in this worldview, was secondary to mastery achieved before the battle began. Across the Pacific, appearances reinforced the illusion. The US fleet lay damaged at Pearl Harbor, its battleships sunk or crippled, its confidence presumed shattered. American newspapers spoke openly of recovery timelines measured in years. To Japanese observers, the conclusion seemed obvious. Whatever strength America possessed in industry, it would not translate quickly into effective combat power at sea. What Japan did not see was what could not be photographed from the air. In quiet rooms thousands of miles away, American codebreakers were working methodically through intercepted transmissions, reconstructing Japanese plans piece by piece. Intelligence, not intuition, was shaping American movement. At sea, carrier crews trained relentlessly, knowing they were outmatched on paper and expected to lose. That expectation bred focus rather than fear. Japan remained unaware that the Americans preparing for Midway were not fighting for dominance, but for survival. They were not bound by tradition or convinced of superiority. They were adapting because they had no other choice. At Midway, these two trajectories, confidence hardened into assumption, and underestimation transformed into preparation, were about to collide, with consequences neither side fully understood. Operation MI was conceived as a demonstration of inevitability. In Japanese planning rooms, the battle for Midway was not framed as a gamble, but as a controlled conclusion. By drawing out what remained of the US Pacific Fleet and destroying it in detail, Japan would remove the last obstacle to its defensive perimeter. The assumption beneath the plan was clear and unchallenged. The Americans would respond as expected, slowly, cautiously, and too late. Japanese intelligence reinforced this confidence rather than tested it. Intercepts were read selectively, filtered through the belief that American commanders lacked both initiative and clarity after Pearl Harbor. The possibility that US codebreakers were reading Japanese naval traffic was dismissed as improbable. Encryption systems were considered secure not because they had been proven so, but because no one believed the Americans capable of breaking them in time to matter. This conviction shaped every element of the operation. Japanese planners assumed the US Navy would react defensively to the threat against Midway, dispatching forces piecemeal once the island was already under attack. The Japanese fleet would then spring its trap, engaging American carriers from a position of overwhelming advantage. It was a plan built not just on superior force, but on superior expectation. On the morning of June 4, that confidence translated into action. Japanese carriers launched their first strike against Midway with calm efficiency. Aircraft were spotted, armed, and dispatched as if following a script already rehearsed to its conclusion. Admiral Nagumo's command decisions reflected this mindset. He expected time to assess, time to rearm, time to choose the moment of engagement. The enemy, in his estimation, would provide it. What Nagumo did not expect was urgency on the other side of the ocean. American carriers were not waiting to be drawn out. They were already moving, already positioned, already acting on information Japan believed impossible for them to possess. The U.S. Navy was not reacting to Japanese moves. It was anticipating them. This disconnect ran deeper than tactics. Japanese doctrine assumed timidity where there was resolve, hesitation where there was calculation. Nagumo's hesitation, his repeated delays in launching a second strike, was shaped by the belief that the Americans would not seize the initiative even if given the chance. That belief bought minutes. Those minutes proved decisive. Below decks and across the Pacific, American sailors were executing a plan built on risk rather than certainty. They knew they were outnumbered. They knew their margin for error was thin. But they also knew where the Japanese carriers would be, and roughly when. That knowledge transformed weakness into opportunity. Operation MI had been designed as an ambush. In practice, it became an exposure. The Japanese fleet moved forward believing it controlled the pace of battle, unaware that its assumptions had already surrendered that control. As the carriers closed on Midway, one navy still trusted doctrine forged in past victories. The other was writing a new one in real time, faster than Japan realized, and closer than it imagined. Pearl Harbor did not only damage ships, it stripped away assumptions. In the weeks that followed, American sailors understood with unusual clarity that the old Navy no longer existed. What replaced it was not fully formed doctrine, but urgency. Carrier warfare, still experimental before the war, was rewritten in months rather than years. Flight operations accelerated, training cycles compressed. Mistakes were corrected not through committees, but through repetition, under pressure. Carrier task forces learned to move faster than expected, launching, recovering, and rearming aircraft at a tempo that strained men and machines alike. Deck crews drilled until motion became instinct, aircraft flowing across wooden planks in carefully controlled chaos. Pilots were pushed to fly more sorties, navigate farther, and land under conditions once considered unacceptable. There was no luxury of gradual improvement. The next battle would not wait. One lesson from Pearl Harbor eclipsed all others. Ships would be hit. Survival depended on what happened next. Damage control was elevated from procedure to culture. Sailors trained relentlessly to seal compartments, fight fires, reroute power, and keep ships afloat under catastrophic conditions. Every man learned that survival was collective. A single failure could doom an entire crew. The American fleet would not be harder to hit, but it would be harder to kill. Technology accelerated this transformation. Radar, once auxiliary, became central to fleet movement. Operators learned to interpret faint echoes at long range, tracking aircraft beyond visual sight and feeding that information directly to commanders. For the first time, American carriers could anticipate contact rather than stumble into it. To Japanese planners accustomed to visual reconnaissance and doctrine-driven timing, this invisible awareness would come as an unwelcome surprise. In the air, tactics evolved just as quickly. American pilots studied Japanese combat air patrol patterns, identifying strengths and vulnerabilities. Dive bombing techniques were refined to exploit altitude, sun position, and timing. Pilots were drilled to attack from unexpected vectors, splitting fighter coverage and forcing defenders to choose between threats. These were not elegant solutions. They were practical ones born from necessity rather than theory. The cost was exhaustion. Crews slept in fragments, ate when they could, and worked until fatigue blurred into routine. But urgency became its own discipline. American sailors understood they were not expected to win cleanly. They were expected to endure long enough to learn. That understanding reshaped morale. Confidence did not come from superiority, but from preparation under constraint. From Japan's perspective, this transformation bordered on impossibility. No navy, they believed, could absorb a blow like Pearl Harbor and emerge operational within months. Training took years. Cohesion took longer. American speed looked superficial numbers masquerading as capability. What Japan did not see was that the pressure of near defeat had stripped away hesitation. Adaptation was no longer optional. It was instinct. By the time American carriers turned toward Midway, they were not the same force Japan believed it was facing. Doctrine had shifted quietly, invisibly, and faster than intelligence estimates allowed. The U.S. Navy was still outmatched on paper, but it was no longer predictable. What remained was opportunity, and in war, opportunity rarely announces itself. It appears briefly to those prepared to act faster than their enemy expects. Before Midway announced itself in fire and smoke, it whispered through smaller signs that Japan chose not to hear. In the months after Pearl Harbor, American submarines began operating with a sharpness that contradicted every pre-war assumption. Patrols grew bolder. Ambushes came closer to Japanese-held waters. Torpedoes were still unreliable, tactics still imperfect, but intent was unmistakable. The U.S. Navy was not waiting. It was probing, learning, and pressing forward. The most unsettling sign arrived in dry dock. After the Battle of the Coral Sea, USS Yorktown limped back to Pearl Harbor, bearing the scars of combat holes torn through her flight deck, damage that Japanese planners believed would sideline any carrier for months. Instead, American engineers swarmed the ship. Crews worked around the clock, cutting, welding, rerouting power, improvising solutions where blueprints ended. In just 72 hours, Yorktown returned to sea. To Japanese observers, had they known, the feat would have seemed impossible. To Americans, it was simply necessary. At sea, the U.S. carrier force moved with an unfamiliar cohesion. Hornet, Enterprise, and the hastily repaired Yorktown operated not as isolated ships, but as a coordinated system. Launch cycles tightened, communications improved. Task force commanders synchronized movements with growing confidence. These were not the hesitant maneuvers of a fleet recovering from shock. They were the motions of sailors who understood their limitations and compensated for them deliberately. Within Japanese staff circles, these developments were noticed and dismissed. Reports of aggressive submarine activity were attributed to coincidence. The rapid reappearance of Yorktown was not fully believed. Precision in American carrier movements was written off as temporary alignment rather than systemic change. Doctrine, once validated by victory, proved resistant to contradiction. Anomalies were easier to ignore than assumptions were to revise. Meanwhile, American reconnaissance was extending its reach. Long-range patrol aircraft pushed farther west, guided by intelligence that Japanese planners did not believe the enemy possessed. Sightings were made earlier than expected. Contact reports arrived with unsettling accuracy. The Japanese fleet, confident in its concealment and timetable, was being watched more closely than it realized. None of this amounted to alarm yet. There were no emergency conferences, no dramatic reassessments. But beneath the surface, a quiet tension emerged. The Americans were appearing sooner than predicted. They were recovering faster than doctrine allowed. They were behaving less like the enemy Japan had prepared for, and more like one still defining itself in motion. Worldviews rarely collapse all at once. They fracture along hairline cracks, dismissed until pressure widens them beyond repair. On the eve of Midway, those cracks were already there, subtle, ignored, and spreading. Ahead lay the moment when dismissal would no longer be possible, when scattered signs would converge into undeniable fact, and when Japan would be forced to confront its enemy not as imagined, but as it truly was under the unforgiving glare of battle. The first blows at Midway fell not against ships, but against an island Japan believed already beaten. At dawn on June 4, Japanese aircraft descended on Midway Atoll, expecting little more than token resistance. The island was isolated, lightly defended, and scheduled for capture once American interference was eliminated. For the pilots launching from Nagumo's carriers, the strike was a formality, an opening act, before the real battle at sea. Instead, they met defiance. Marine fighters rose to meet them, outnumbered and outclassed, yet aggressive. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire from sand and steel, filling the sky with fragments and smoke. Bombs struck runways and installations, but not cleanly. Aircraft were damaged, formations broke, timing slipped. The defenders of Midway did not stop the attack, but they disrupted it, and disruption, in carrier warfare, was never trivial. From the Japanese perspective, these were irritations, not alarms. Damage assessments suggested the island was still operational, requiring a second strike. That conclusion carried consequences. Aircraft returning to the carriers landed with partial fuel, incomplete reports, and growing urgency. Deck crews began rearming planes, shifting bombs and torpedoes in response to evolving orders. The choreography of carrier operations, normally precise, grew crowded and compressed. Even so, confidence held. The Americans, Nagumo believed, had yet to appear. What little resistance Midway offered only reinforced the assumption that U.S. forces were distant, hesitant, or already neutralized. The real threat, it seemed, had not yet arrived. It had. While Japanese planners weighed their next move, American torpedo bombers were already in the air, flying low, slow, and exposed. Squadrons from Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown pressed forward without adequate fighter escort, knowing the odds and accepting them. These attacks were not elegant. They were not successful in the narrow sense. Torpedoes missed. Aircraft were cut down one by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Entire squadrons were nearly annihilated. But their effect could not be measured in hits alone. The torpedo bombers forced the Japanese to react. Combat air patrol fighters descended to sea level to intercept them, drawn away from altitude in pursuit of immediate threats. Defensive formations stretched downward, concentrating on what was visible and urgent. Above them, the sky emptied quietly. From the decks of the Japanese carriers, the torpedo attacks appeared clumsy and desperate, exactly the kind of effort Japan expected from an inferior enemy. There was no sign of coordination, no evidence of overarching plan. Only persistence, repeated again and again at terrible cost. Japanese confidence held. The Americans were brave, perhaps, but bravery without finesse was not strategy. What went unseen was the space these sacrifices created. High above, American dive bombers were searching, navigating by instinct, fuel state, and fragments of intelligence. They had missed their rendezvous points. They were low on time, yet they continued, pressing forward not because success was assured, but because failure meant nothing left to lose. When they finally broke through the clouds, what they found was not a wall of fighters, but an opening. The Japanese carriers lay below, decks crowded with aircraft, munitions, and fuel lines exposed. Combat air patrol fighters were out of position, focused on threats already spent. The layered defense Japan relied upon had been bent downward, leaving the top uncovered. No alarm sounded in time to correct it. No command order recognized the danger. The Japanese system had responded exactly as doctrine dictated, efficiently, decisively, and fatally. In those minutes, the meaning of the torpedo squadron's sacrifice became clear. They had not failed. They had fixed the enemy in place, drawn his attention, and shaped the battle space at the cost of their own survival. It was an act Japan had not anticipated, nor fully understood. A hole had opened in the sky above the Japanese fleet. It existed only briefly. It was unintentional, and it was about to be exploited by sailors Japan believed incapable of such coordination under fire. The battle had reached its hinge. What followed would not depend on numbers or tradition, but on who could recognize opportunity in chaos and act before it vanished. The American dive bombers did not arrive together, and they did not arrive where anyone expected them to be. They came in fragments, small groups of SBD Dauntless aircraft, scattered by missed rendezvous points and thinning fuel gauges. Many pilots believed they were too late, that the battle had already passed beneath them. And then, almost without warning, the cloud cover broke. Below them lay the Japanese carriers Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu, steaming into the wind. Their decks were alive with activity, aircraft refueling, bombs stacked, torpedoes exposed, crews rushing to respond to threats they believed already contained. It was the most dangerous moment in carrier warfare when preparation crowded the flight deck and order gave way to compression. It was also the moment Japanese doctrine assumed would never be seen by the enemy. From altitude, the Americans understood instantly what they were looking at. This was not luck in the narrow sense. The timing was the product of weeks of code breaking, hours of risk-heavy flight decisions, and the quiet instinct of pilots who chose not to turn back when logic suggested they should. They had followed smoke on the horizon. They had trusted partial information. They had pressed forward because waiting offered nothing. The dives began almost simultaneously. Dauntless bombers rolled onto their backs and tipped downward, engines screaming as they fell toward the carriers below. Anti-aircraft fire erupted too late and too scattered. Japanese fighters were still low over the sea, their attention fixed on threats that had already sacrificed themselves. The layered defense Japan relied upon was momentarily hollow at the top. Bombs struck with devastating precision. On Kaga, explosions ripped through the hangar deck. igniting fuel lines and detonating stored munitions. On Soryu, hits triggered fires that raced through the ship faster than crews could respond. Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, absorbed a single bomb, but it was enough. Flames spread into spaces crowded with aircraft and ordnance, sealing the carrier's fate. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 frontline carriers were mortally wounded. The speed of the destruction stunned everyone who witnessed it. 5 minutes earlier, these ships represented the core of Japanese naval power. Now they were burning hulks, smoke rising in columns visible for miles. The transformation defied every assumption Japanese planners had carried into the battle. Carriers were supposed to fall after prolonged engagement, not vanish between one decision and the next. For the American pilots pulling out of their dives, there was little celebration. Many were nearly out of fuel. Some were wounded. Others were disoriented by the violence they had just delivered. But they understood what they had done. This was not a raid. It was a rupture. The balance of the Pacific War had shifted in the time it took to descend from altitude. Among Japanese survivors, disbelief spread quickly. The Americans had not only struck, they had struck at exactly the wrong moment, with exactly the right force. This was the behavior of a navy that understood timing, risk, and coordination under extreme pressure. It contradicted everything Japan believed about American sailors, that they were slow, predictable, incapable of seizing fleeting opportunity. Firefighting efforts aboard the stricken carriers proved futile. Damage control teams fought bravely, but the conditions were beyond containment. Heat built. Explosions followed. Orders were eventually given to abandon ships that hours earlier had symbolized Japanese dominance at sea. Sailors entered the water surrounded by burning fuel and wreckage, watching the world they trusted collapse around them. Yet the battle was not over. One Japanese carrier, Haiyu, remained operational. Even in shock, the Imperial Navy was not finished fighting. From the smoke and confusion, a final counterstrike was already forming an attempt to prove that Japanese doctrine, though wounded, was not yet broken. The Americans had shattered the plan, but they had not yet secured the outcome. What followed would test whether this moment was an anomaly or the beginning of a new reality the Pacific War could not reverse. For a brief moment after the devastation of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, the Japanese fleet still possessed a heartbeat. The carrier Hiryu, separated from the others and untouched by the initial attack, remained operational. Her flight deck was scarred by smoke and confusion, but her air group was intact. For Japanese commanders reeling from shock, Hiryu represented more than a weapon. She represented proof that the battle was not yet lost. From her decks rose the counterstrike. Dive bombers and fighters clawed their way into the sky, guided by fragments of contact reports and instinct rather than certainty. They found their target in the American carrier Yorktown. Bombs struck with precision, punching through her decks, igniting fires and halting flight operations. To Japanese observers, it appeared decisive. The Americans, so unexpectedly effective moments earlier, were now absorbing punishment in plain view. But Yorktown did not die. Damage control teams surged into action with a discipline forged since Pearl Harbor. Fires were isolated, power rerouted, compartments sealed. Within hours, astonishingly, Yorktown was moving again. Her decks cleared, her silhouette still operational. To Japanese pilots returning to Hairu, the sight was disorienting. The ship they believed crippled remained afloat, defiant, and dangerous. A second strike followed, driven by urgency and disbelief. Torpedoes found their mark this time. Tearing into Yorktown's hull, she listed heavily, power failed, and evacuation orders followed. At last, the carrier seemed finished. Japanese officers recorded the result with confidence. The Americans had been punished. Balance, they hoped, was being restored. Yet even now, the revelation was not complete. What stunned Japanese observers was not that Yorktown had been hit, but how long she had endured. Twice struck, twice brought back from the edge. American ships, they were discovering, did not conform to expected timelines of destruction. They absorbed damage, adapted, and continued to function longer than doctrine allowed. It was not recklessness, it was preparation. While Hairyu's aircraft fought and fell, American forces were already hunting her. The search was improvised, driven by intuition and persistence rather than textbook procedure. Pilots followed smoke columns. Reconnaissance aircraft pushed beyond assigned sectors. Communication was imperfect. fuel dangerously low. But the Americans understood one truth clearly: if Hiryu survived, the battle remained unfinished. Late in the afternoon, American dive bombers found her. Once again, altitude became advantage. Once again, timing proved fatal. Bombs struck Hiryu's flight deck and hangars, igniting fires that raced beyond containment. The last Japanese carrier burned as fiercely as the others, her crew fighting valiantly against forces already beyond control. By nightfall, the decision was inevitable: Hiryu would be abandoned. With her loss, something deeper than ships was destroyed. Japanese carrier doctrine built on elite crews, perfect coordination, and decisive initiative had been broken in practice. It had not failed because it was weak, but because it was rigid. It could not absorb surprise at the speed the Americans imposed. For Japanese commanders, the realization came quietly and with lasting weight. The Americans were not simply persistent, they were adaptive. They repaired faster than expected, struck sooner than predicted, and learned while fighting. This was not the behavior of an inferior navy growing desperate. It was the emergence of a system capable of evolving under fire. As night settled over the Pacific, burning carriers marked the sea with fading light. The Battle of Midway was not yet complete in its consequences, but its meaning was already clear. Japan had entered the fight, believing it understood the character of its enemy. It was wrong. What followed would not be a single reversal, but a permanent shift, one that turned Midway from a battle into a turning point, and revealed that the Pacific War had entered a phase from which Japan could not recover. The destruction at Midway did not end when the fires burned out. Its true force arrived afterward, as numbers were counted and absences confirmed. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, but ships alone did not define the scale of the blow. What could not be replaced were the men who had flown from their decks. Veteran pilots, instructors, and squadron leaders were gone in an afternoon. Japan's carrier arm had been amputated at the joint. In theory, ships could be rebuilt. Steel could be laid down, hulls launched, engines installed, but pilots required years, not months. Japan's pre-war system had produced a small elite through ruthless selection and long training. That system had never been designed for rapid expansion or recovery. Midway exposed the flaw with brutal clarity. The carriers that followed would sail without the aircrews that had made Japanese doctrine lethal. Inside the Imperial Japanese Navy, the shock traveled upward through command circles that had rarely questioned their assumptions. Reports from Midway forced a reassessment not just of tactics, but of the enemy itself. American sailors had not panicked. They had coordinated under pressure. They had accepted risk, absorbed losses, and struck with discipline when opportunity appeared. This was not the behavior of a material-heavy but spirit-poor opponent. It was professionalism under fire. For the United States Navy, Midway became proof rather than promise. American sailors had executed a complex carrier battle with imperfect information, stretched resources, and no margin for retreat. They had coordinated submarines, reconnaissance aircraft, torpedo squadrons, and dive bombers across hundreds of miles of ocean. Success had not come from flawless execution, but from persistence aligned with learning. Mistakes were made and corrected within hours. The battle revealed something Japan had failed to consider. American adaptability was not accidental, it was cultural. U.S. naval doctrine did not rely on pre-war perfection, but on adjustment under stress. Commanders were empowered to improvise. Pilots were encouraged to act on judgment rather than wait for instruction. Damage control was decentralized, initiative expected. What appeared chaotic to Japanese observers was, in fact, flexible design. Midway exposed the depth of Japan's misreading. American culture had been interpreted as softness. In reality, it allowed for faster learning and recovery. Where Japan prized refinement achieved before battle, the Americans refined themselves during it. The result was not just victory, but acceleration. Each engagement made the U.S. Navy more dangerous, not less. The psychological impact was immediate. The myth of American inferiority, carefully cultivated before the war, collapsed almost overnight. Japanese officers who had believed the enemy lacked resolve now confronted evidence that resolve had never been the limiting factor. What they had mistaken for weakness was capacity held in reserve. Midway had forced it into the open. Strategically, the balance of the Pacific shifted in a way that could not be reversed. Japan lost the initiative it had seized at Pearl Harbor. No longer could it dictate where and when decisive battle would occur. From this point forward, Japan would respond more often than it acted, defending territory rather than expanding it. The perimeter became something to hold, not extend. For American sailors, Midway did not breed complacency. It bred momentum. Confidence replaced uncertainty, but not caution. The lesson was not that the enemy was weak, it was that he could be beaten through preparation, intelligence, and adaptation. The Navy emerged from Midway with a new understanding of itself and of what modern naval war required. The shockwave of Midway extended far beyond the burning carriers. It altered expectations on both sides of the Pacific. Japan now faced an opponent it no longer underestimated. The United States now understood it could win not through numbers alone, but through learning faster than its enemy could recover. From that moment forward, the war no longer moved at Japan's pace. It moved at America's. And as momentum began to build beneath the surface of the Pacific, the question was no longer whether the United States could adapt, but how quickly that adaptation would reshape every battle yet to come. Midway did not end with a single revelation. It began a process. For the U.S. Navy, the battle became a living classroom, one whose lessons were absorbed, refined, and institutionalized with remarkable speed. American pilots returned from the fight with hard-earned clarity about what had worked and what had nearly failed. Dive bombing doctrine was sharpened immediately, attack coordination improved, and emphasis placed on timing, altitude discipline, and mutual support. What had been achieved under improvisation at Midway would be repeated with intention in the battles to come. Damage control emerged as one of the war's most decisive, if least celebrated, innovations. The survival of Yorktown twice was not treated as an anomaly. It was studied. Procedures were standardized, redundancies added, training intensified. Crews across the fleet learned to fight fires, contain flooding, and reroute systems as a matter of instinct. American ships were redesigned not to avoid damage, but to endure it. Survival became a function of preparation rather than fortune. Industrial momentum amplified these gains. New carriers entered service with improved layouts, stronger flight decks, and radar systems that extended awareness far beyond the horizon. Radar-directed fighter control transformed air defense, allowing American commanders to position aircraft where they were needed before threats became visible. Each new hull carried forward lessons learned in blood and smoke. The fleet was not merely expanding, it was evolving. Japan could not match this pace. The loss of veteran aircrews at Midway created a deficit that no amount of shipbuilding could correct. Training pipelines lengthened as fuel shortages deepened and experienced instructors vanished. Pilots reached combat units with fewer hours and less preparation, expected to perform at levels once achieved only after years of refinement. Innovation slowed as survival replaced experimentation. Doctrine hardened rather than adapted. With each engagement, the imbalance grew more pronounced. American pilots entered battle with increasing confidence, backed by systems designed to support initiative and recovery. Japanese pilots flew with courage, but under constraints that narrowed options and punished error. Where the U.S. Navy treated combat as feedback, Japan treated it as validation of established belief. One approach accelerated learning. The other resisted it. The result was cumulative strength on one side and cumulative strain on the other. Battles no longer reset the balance, they widened the gap. The U.S. Navy emerged stronger after each encounter, its tactics refined, its crews seasoned, its confidence grounded in experience rather than assumption. Japan, by contrast, fought each new battle with diminishing margin and growing desperation. Strategically, this shift forced Japan onto the defensive. Initiative once seized boldly was surrendered gradually, then completely. Operations became reactive, shaped by American movement, rather than Japanese intent. The Pacific War no longer unfolded according to Japan's timetable. It advanced according to America's capacity to learn and apply force faster than its enemy could adapt. For American sailors, Midway marked the end of uncertainty. They no longer wondered whether they could fight effectively at sea. They had done so and prevailed. But that confidence was tempered by realism. Victory had been narrow, costly, and contingent. It reinforced not arrogance, but urgency. The understanding was clear. The enemy remained dangerous, and complacency would be fatal. As new task forces assembled and doctrines matured, the direction of the war began to reveal itself. It would not be decided by a single engagement, but by a pattern, one side growing more capable with each test, the other bleeding expertise it could never fully replace. The conclusion of the Pacific War was still distant, but its shape was becoming visible, and in that emerging outline, the decisive factor was no longer surprise or tradition, but the ability to learn faster than defeat could teach. Midway did not end the Pacific War. It rewrote its trajectory. The battles that followed Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, unfolded across years and thousands of miles, yet they carried a common imprint. In each, American sailors fought with a confidence rooted not in inevitability, but in memory. They had seen what adaptation could achieve when applied under pressure. They trusted their systems because those systems had already been tested at the edge of failure. At Guadalcanal, the war became a grinding contest of endurance rather than a clash of perfect plans. American forces arrived underprepared and outnumbered, yet they improvised relentlessly. Radar-guided night interceptions. Logistics were reworked in real time. Sailors fought knowing that survival depended on flexibility rather than flawless execution. The confidence born at Midway did not guarantee success, but it prevented paralysis. As the war expanded, Japan's early superiority steadily eroded. Carrier battles that once favored elite Japanese aircrews now tilted toward American formations, coordinated by radar, radio discipline, and layered defense. At the Philippine Sea, Japanese pilots flew bravely, but into a system designed to absorb and counter them. Radar-directed fighter control shattered the advantage of surprise, turning attacks into attritional losses Japan could not afford. What became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was less a single event than a demonstration of imbalance. Leyte Gulf confirmed what Midway had begun. American carrier task forces operated as integrated machines, air, surface, and logistics synchronized across vast distances. Commanders coordinated strikes, defense, and recovery with a precision that did not rely on perfect conditions. Damage was anticipated, losses were mitigated, the system bent, but it did not break. Japan's remaining naval strength was committed with courage and desperation, but without the adaptive depth to match what it faced. Throughout these battles, the pattern repeated. American innovation accelerated. Japanese doctrine hardened. Radar nullified night attacks once considered decisive. Training pipelines expanded on one side and constricted on the other. Where Japan's navy had once relied on qualitative superiority, it now confronted an opponent whose strength multiplied with experience. Carrier task forces emerged as unmatched operational systems, mobile, resilient, and responsive. They did not depend on individual brilliance alone, but on integration, intelligence, air power, logistics, and command woven into a coherent whole. This was not a return to tradition. It was a departure from it, shaped by lessons learned under fire. Midway, in retrospect, marked the philosophical turning point. It was the moment when assumptions gave way to evidence, when adaptability proved more powerful than refinement achieved before battle. From that point onward, the Pacific War was no longer about who had prepared best in peace, but about who could learn fastest in war. By the time Japan's final naval engagements were fought, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The superiority Japan had once claimed had not vanished overnight, it had been overtaken. The Americans had not simply matched their enemy, they had surpassed him by evolving beyond expectation. As the guns fell silent and wreckage settled beneath the waves, the meaning of Midway stood clear. It was not merely a victory, it was a transformation, one that reshaped every battle that followed and set the terms for how the war would end. What remained was to reckon with the cost of that transformation and the assumptions that had made it necessary. The cost of Midway cannot be measured only in ships sunk or battles won. Its deeper price lay in belief, specifically in how confidence hardened into certainty and certainty into collapse. Japan did not lose at Midway because it lacked courage or skill. It lost because it misjudged the character of its enemy and built strategy upon that error. The belief in American inferiority did not merely underestimate the United States. It shaped decisions that left no margin for surprise. Cultural arrogance proved as dangerous as any weapon. Japanese doctrine assumed that discipline, sacrifice, and initiative belonged almost exclusively to one side of the Pacific. This assumption discouraged skepticism and rewarded conformity. When evidence appeared that contradicted it, faster, American recovery, aggressive reconnaissance, coordinated attacks, it was dismissed as anomaly rather than warning. Midway revealed the cost of that blindness in a single morning. The human losses were immediate and irreversible. Thousands of Japanese aircrew, many of them among the most experienced carrier pilots in the world, were killed. These were not replaceable units. They were instructors, leaders, and repositories of hard-earned combat knowledge. Their deaths hollowed out the Imperial Japanese Navy in a way no ship loss could. New carriers would sail later in the war, but without the airmen who had once given Japanese aviation its edge. Among survivors, the reckoning was quiet and enduring. Officers revisited decisions made under confidence they had never questioned. Some wondered whether Midway could have been fought differently. Others recognized, too late, that the enemy they had prepared for never truly existed. The realization was not merely tactical, it was personal. Pride had shaped perception, and perception had shaped fate. American sailors carried their own burden from Midway. Victory did not erase loss. Entire torpedo squadrons had been destroyed. Pilots and crewmen were gone without recovery, their sacrifice understood fully only after the outcome was known. Survivors lived with the knowledge that success had depended on others flying missions that could not succeed. Confidence grew, but it was tempered by memory. For many Americans, Midway marked the end of innocence. The battle proved they could fight and win against the most formidable naval force in the world. But it also revealed the cost of modern war at sea. Precision did not prevent death. Adaptation did not spare grief. The ocean swallowed wreckage and men alike, indifferent to outcome. Both sides emerged changed. Japan lost more than material advantage. It lost the certainty that had guided its expansion. The United States gained momentum, but also responsibility. Victory placed demands on learning, production, and leadership that would only intensify as the war continued. The Pacific conflict did not become easier after Midway. It became clearer. What Midway ultimately exposed was the danger of fighting a war against an imagined enemy. Japan had prepared to defeat an opponent shaped by stereotype rather than observation. When reality intruded, doctrine proved brittle. The Americans, by contrast, had prepared to lose, and in doing so, learned how to adapt. That difference proved decisive. Misjudgment carries a unique cruelty. It convinces those who hold it that correction is unnecessary until correction becomes impossible. Midway stands as a stark example of how cultural assumptions can masquerade as strategic insight, and how quickly they can unravel under pressure. As the wreckage settled and the war pressed on, the lesson lingered beneath the surface. Battles are not decided solely by weapons or numbers, but by understanding of oneself and of the enemy. When that understanding fails, the cost is not abstract. It is paid in lives, in lost futures, and in paths that can never be retraced. From that cost would emerge a legacy studied long after the guns fell silent, a warning etched into history, waiting to be remembered. In the years that followed the war, Midway did not fade into legend so much as it hardened into lesson. Within Japan, the battle became a subject of sustained study, examined not to relive defeat, but to understand it. Naval historians and former officers returned repeatedly to the same conclusion. The loss was not simply tactical, it was conceptual. American sailors had demonstrated a level of skill, coordination, and adaptability that Japanese planners had never fully credited. Respect, earned through fire, replaced the certainty that had preceded the war. This reassessment was not immediate, nor was it comfortable. For a navy built on elite tradition, acknowledging misjudgment required confronting deeply held beliefs about culture and warfare. Yet over time, Japanese analyses grew frank. Midway was recognized as the moment when assumptions about American inferiority collapsed under evidence. The enemy had not only matched Japan's best, it had surpassed it by learning faster, coordinating more flexibly, and accepting risk without paralysis. In the United States, Midway was absorbed differently. The battle did not become an excuse for complacency, but a foundation for institutional change. The U.S. Navy codified the lessons learned under pressure, the integration of intelligence into operations, the centrality of radar, and the necessity of empowering commanders to act on incomplete information. Flexibility was no longer an abstract virtue, it became doctrine. Intelligence, in particular, was elevated from support function to strategic pillar. Code-breaking successes at Midway demonstrated that information, when acted upon decisively, could offset numerical disadvantage. The Navy invested heavily in signals intelligence, reconnaissance, and communication networks, ensuring that future commanders would not fight blind. The war had proven that knowledge, fused with action, could determine outcomes in minutes. Globally, Midway accelerated a transformation already underway. Naval warfare shifted decisively toward carrier dominance, not merely as a matter of platform, but of system. Battleships gave way to mobile air power, and fleets became networks of sensors, aircraft, and logistics rather than formations of guns. Nations studying the Pacific War recognized that control of the sea now depended on control of the air above it, and on the ability to coordinate that control across vast distances. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Midway lay in how it reframed assumptions themselves. Pre-war doctrines around the world had been built on static expectations, fixed ideas about national character, training superiority, and how an enemy would behave under pressure. Midway exposed the danger of those assumptions. It demonstrated that doctrine, no matter how refined, must evolve or fail when confronted with an opponent willing to adapt. Military academies across generations returned to Midway as a case study in strategic humility. Officers were taught not only what happened, but why it happened, how confidence slid into arrogance, how success bred blindness, and how underestimation became fatal. The battle's value lay not in its drama, but in its warning that wars are lost as often in planning rooms as on battlefields. In the Pacific, the influence of Midway extended far beyond 1942. American strategy for decades reflected its lessons emphasizing forward intelligence, flexible task forces, and rapid decision-making. Even as technology evolved, the core insight endured. Superiority is not a permanent condition. It must be renewed continuously through learning. For Japan, Midway remained a point of reflection rather than myth. It was studied as the moment when the trajectory of the war changed, but also as a reminder that excellence without adaptability invites defeat. The respect earned for American sailors did not diminish Japanese courage. It clarified the nature of the contest they had entered. Over time, Midway became less about who won and more about what it revealed. It showed that the true measure of a fighting force is not how perfectly it executes a plan, but how it responds when that plan collapses. It demonstrated that humility, forced or chosen, can be as decisive as firepower. As generations of sailors studied the battle, one conclusion remained consistent. Midway was not an accident. It was the outcome of preparation meeting opportunity, of learning overcoming assumption. And in that sense, its legacy extended beyond one war, shaping how navies around the world would think about conflict, adaptation, and respect for the enemy they faced. All that remained was to return to the human dimension, to the moment when those assumptions shattered, and to the meaning that moment still carries. Japan entered the Pacific War with certainty, not curiosity. Its leaders believed they understood the nature of the enemy across the ocean, that American sailors were industrious but fragile, efficient but unwilling to endure sustained pressure. This belief shaped plans, doctrine, and expectation. It allowed confidence to harden into assumption, and assumption to replace observation. By the summer of 1942, that certainty had gone unchallenged for too long. Midway shattered it in minutes. The illusion did not collapse because of overwhelming force, but because of unexpected behavior. American sailors did not retreat when faced with loss. They did not pause to restore order before acting. They adapted in motion, absorbing punishment while shaping opportunity. What Japan witnessed that morning was not improvisation born of desperation, but learning accelerated by necessity. The battle revealed a deeper truth about strength. Discipline, tradition, and refinement mattered, but they were not enough. Adaptability proved rarer and more decisive. The Americans did not arrive at Midway with perfect plans. They arrived willing to adjust, to risk failure, and to accept loss in pursuit of effect. That willingness allowed them to exploit moments that doctrine alone could not foresee. Japan's navy had been built on excellence achieved before battle. It trusted that preparation would dictate outcome. At Midway, that trust became a constraint. When the plan fractured, adjustment lagged, assumptions about the enemy delayed recognition of danger. By the time understanding arrived, the moment had passed. What followed was not simply defeat, but exposure. For American sailors, Midway was not an ending. It was a beginning. Confidence grew not from dominance, but from discovery, from realizing that they could learn faster than their enemy could respond. That capacity would define the remainder of the war. Each battle refined it. Each loss sharpened it. The US Navy did not become unstoppable overnight. It became adaptable, and that proved enough. Misjudgment turned into irreversible consequence. Japan had not merely underestimated American material power, it had misunderstood American resilience. It had prepared to fight a caricature and was instead confronted by a system that evolved under pressure. The respect earned in that confrontation was real, but it arrived too late to alter the outcome. Midway became the moment when arrogance gave way to recognition. Not because one side lacked courage, but because one side could not change quickly enough. The battle did not erase Japan's skill or bravery. It revealed the limits of both when adaptation was absent. History often remembers battles for their violence or scale. Midway is remembered for its clarity. In a single morning, it stripped away illusion and exposed reality. It showed that war is not won by believing an enemy is weak, but by understanding how they respond when tested. This is why Midway shattered Japanese assumptions, because in one morning, they met an enemy they had never imagined. Sailors who refused to break and who learned faster than war could stop them.